My wife denied me intimacy every day after our wedding for 2 months. When I confronted her, she said, "My body, my choice, you have no right." So I filed for the marriage to be dissolved by the court. What happened next was rather unexpected. Wife's 187 missed calls. So here's the deal. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 36 years old, and I genuinely thought I'd hit the jackpot when I married Clara. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Oh great, another sob story from some middle-aged dude who can't figure out women. But hear me out, because this isn't your typical, "my wife doesn't understand me" bullshit that you'd find scribbled on some Reddit forum at 2 a.m. The wedding was straight out of a damn fairy tale, and I'm not even being sarcastic here for once. Picture this. Clara looked absolutely stunning in this flowing white dress that probably cost more than my first car. The venue was this gorgeous lakeside resort that made everyone's Instagram stories look like professional photography, and the whole thing was packed with more laughter and happy tears than a rom-com marathon. Hell, even my cynical ass got choked up when I saw her walking down that aisle. The promises we made to each other? They felt real, you know? Like we were actually building something solid together, something that would last longer than a TikTok trend. I genuinely believed that intimacy would follow naturally after we said, "I do." Call me old-fashioned or whatever, but I figured that's how marriage worked. You love each other, you commit to each other, and then you actually, connect with each other on every level. Physical, emotional, spiritual, the whole 9 yards. I mean, we'd been together for 2 years before tying the knot, and while we kept things pretty traditional in terms of waiting, there was definitely chemistry between us. The kind that made me think our honeymoon was going to be absolutely incredible. But oh boy, was I in for a rude awakening that would make a cold shower feel like a tropical vacation. 2 months. 61 days to be exact, because yeah, I was keeping count like some desperate teenager. Every single night, Clara would find a new and creative way to avoid any kind of physical contact. And I'm not talking about just sex here. I'm talking about everything. No hand-holding, no cuddling on the couch during Netflix binges, no spontaneous kisses in the kitchen while making coffee. Nothing. Nada. Zilch. "I'm tired" became her go-to excuse, delivered with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for reading insurance policies. Or she'd pull the classic move of pretending to fall asleep while scrolling through her phone, which is honestly impressive considering how she could somehow manage to sleep through the bright screen glare but wake up instantly if I shifted positions on my side of the bed. At first, I played the understanding husband role to perfection. I mean, adjusting to married life can be tough, right? Maybe she was stressed from work, or still coming down from the wedding planning chaos, or dealing with some family drama I didn't know about. I convinced myself that patience was the key here, that pushing the issue would only make things worse. So I waited, and waited, and waited some more, like an idiot standing in line for a restaurant that's clearly been closed for hours. But as the weeks crawled by at the speed of government bureaucracy, my patience started transforming into confusion, which then evolved into this bitter, gnawing feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with our marriage. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the hell I'd done wrong. Was I not attractive enough? Not romantic enough? Did I have some kind of weird marriage-killing body odor that only activated after saying vows? The worst part was watching Clara act completely normal in every other aspect of our relationship. She'd chat with me about her day, laugh at my terrible jokes, even plan weekend activities together. But the moment anything might lead to physical intimacy, it was like she had some kind of invisible force field that would activate faster than you could say mood killer. By the time we hit the 2-month mark, I was going slightly insane. Not the fun kind of crazy where you start collecting vintage bottle caps or learning to juggle flaming torches, but the soul-crushing kind where you question your entire existence and wonder if you're the problem in every equation. On night number 60, I finally worked up the courage to have the conversation. You know the one. The relationship talk that every guy dreads more than a root canal performed by a blindfolded dentist. I waited until we were both in bed, the room dark except for the annoying blue glow from her phone screen, and I took a deep breath that felt like it might be my last. "Clara," I said, and my voice cracked like I was going through puberty all over again. The thing is, it wasn't cracking from anger or frustration. It was cracking from pure, unadulterated hurt. "We've been married for 2 months now. Why haven't you touched me once?" Not once. I expected her to get defensive, maybe cry a little, or at least show some kind of emotion that would indicate she gave a damn about my feelings. What I got instead was a response so cold it could have flash frozen a bonfire. She didn't even put down her phone, didn't even look at me, just delivered her answer with the same tone she'd used to tell a telemarketer she wasn't interested. My body, my choice. You have no right. And that's when I felt it. Something inside me didn't just crack. It completely shattered into a million tiny pieces that I knew I'd never be able to put back together. This wasn't the woman I'd fallen in love with. This wasn't the woman who'd promised to love, honor, and cherish me just 60 days ago. This was a stranger wearing my wife's face, delivering a line that sounded like it came straight from some twisted feminist manifesto designed to destroy marriages. That night, lying there in the darkness while Clara went back to scrolling through whatever mindless social media garbage was more important than her husband, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to end this sham of a marriage before it completely poisoned what was left of my soul. Walking into that courthouse felt like stepping into some twisted alternate reality where everything I thought I knew about my life was about to get flipped upside down and shaken like a snow globe handled by an overly enthusiastic toddler. My steps were calm and measured. I'd practiced this walk in my head about 1,000 times over the past few weeks, but my chest felt like it was carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every rejected advance, and every soul-crushing moment of the past 2 months. The courthouse itself was exactly what you'd expect from government architecture. Sterile, intimidating, and designed to make you feel like you're about to get processed through some kind of bureaucratic meat grinder. The kind of place where hope goes to die alongside your faith in the American justice system. But hey, at least the fluorescent lighting was doing wonders for everyone's complexion, and by wonders, I mean making us all look like extras from a zombie apocalypse movie. Clara, of course, arrived fashionably late because apparently even divorce proceedings were just another opportunity for her to make a dramatic entrance. She strutted in wearing this designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, looking like she'd just stepped out of some high-end law firm commercial. The woman had the audacity to wrap herself in expensive fabric and act like she was the victim in this whole twisted scenario. I had to admire her commitment to the performance, even if it made me want to laugh hysterically or maybe just scream into the void. The moment she walked into that courtroom, she immediately shifted into full victim mode faster than a politician changes their stance during election season. Before the judge even had a chance to properly settle in, Clara was already painting this elaborate picture of me as some kind of unstable, demanding monster who was impossible to live with. According to her expertly crafted sob story, I was apparently this controlling husband who made unreasonable demands and created a hostile home environment that would make a maximum security prison look like a cozy bed and breakfast. She talked about how I was emotionally abusive, and let me tell you, that one really stung because it's such a catch-all accusation that's impossible to defend against without sounding defensive. She mentioned my unrealistic expectations and painted herself as this poor, innocent woman who was just trying to navigate married life with a husband who clearly had serious psychological issues. The way she told it, you'd think I was some kind of caveman who expected her to bow down to my every whim while I sat around scratching myself and grunting about my masculine needs. But here's the thing about the truth. It has this annoying habit of being persistent, kind of like that one friend who keeps texting you even after you've clearly ended the conversation. When my turn came to speak, I stood up and felt this weird sense of calm wash over me. Maybe it was because I'd finally reached the point where I had absolutely nothing left to lose, or maybe it was because I knew I was about to drop some truth bombs that would make Clara's carefully constructed facade crumble faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Your Honor, I began, and my voice was steadier than it had been in months. For 2 full months of marriage, I was denied not only physical intimacy, but any form of affection whatsoever. When I finally worked up the courage to ask my wife why this was happening, her response was, and I quote, "My body, my choice. You have no right. This isn't about sex, Your Honor. This is about respect, trust, and the very foundation of what marriage is supposed to represent." I watched as the judge leaned forward slightly, clearly intrigued by this departure from the typical he-said-she-said divorce drama that probably filled his docket on a daily basis. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with the kind of low-level chatter you'd expect from people waiting for their turn to air their dirty laundry in public, suddenly got so quiet you could hear someone's stomach growling 3 rows back. Clara, meanwhile, was maintaining that smug little smirk that had become her signature expression whenever she thought she was winning an argument. You know the look, the one that says, "I'm so much smarter than everyone else in this room, and you're all too stupid to realize it." It's the same expression people get when they think they've successfully manipulated a situation to their advantage, completely oblivious to the fact that their house of cards is about to come crashing down around them. That's when I decided to deliver the knockout punch that I'd been saving for exactly this moment. And Your Honor, I have concrete proof that she never intended to be my wife at all. She had other plans from the very beginning, financial ones. The satisfaction of watching that confident smirk start to crack was better than Christmas morning, winning the lottery, and finding out your favorite TV show got renewed for another season all rolled into one glorious moment. You could actually see the exact second when Clara realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as clever as she thought she was. Her face went through this fascinating transformation that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. Confusion, then concern, then the dawning horror of someone who's just realized they've been playing chess, while everyone else moved on to a completely different game. Her lawyer, some slick-looking guy who probably charged by the minute and had clearly been caught completely off guard by this revelation, started fidgeting with his papers like he was trying to find some magical legal loophole that would make this whole situation disappear. You could practically see him mentally calculating how much his retainer was worth versus how much of his professional reputation he was willing to risk defending someone who was apparently about to be exposed as a fraud. The courtroom atmosphere shifted completely in that moment. What had started as just another routine divorce proceeding was suddenly turning into something much more interesting and potentially criminal. People were sitting up straighter. Phones were discreetly being pulled out to record what was clearly about to become the most entertaining legal drama anyone had witnessed in this sleepy courthouse in months. Clara's confidence, which had been her armor throughout this entire ordeal, was cracking faster than cheap paint in direct sunlight. She was trying to maintain her composure, but you could see her mind racing, probably trying to figure out exactly how much I knew and how screwed she actually was. The woman who had walked into that courtroom acting like she owned the place was suddenly looking around like a cornered animal searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The moment of truth had arrived, and let me tell you, it was more satisfying than finally getting to pop that piece of bubble wrap you've been saving or watching your least favorite reality TV star get voted off the island. I nodded to my lawyer, who handed a manila folder to the bailiff with the kind of reverence usually reserved for handling ancient artifacts or nuclear materials. This folder contained digital screenshots that were about to turn Clara's world into a smoking crater, and I was about to enjoy every single second of watching it happen. The bailiff, a no-nonsense woman who looked like she'd seen every possible flavor of human stupidity parade through this courtroom, walked those screenshots over to the judge like she was delivering someone's death sentence. Which, in a way, she kind of was. The judge adjusted his glasses with the practiced motion of someone who'd spent decades deciphering the bullshit that people tried to pass off as truth in his courtroom, and began reading the first message aloud. "Don't worry, girls. I didn't marry him for love. I needed security. Once I get access to his accounts, he'll be nothing but a stepping stone." The silence that followed was so profound you could have heard a pin drop in the next county. It was the kind of silence that makes you suddenly aware of your own heartbeat, your breathing, and the fact that everyone in the room just collectively realized they were witnessing someone's life implode in real time. The judge's voice had carried Clara's own words with the kind of clarity that made them impossible to misinterpret or explain away. I turned to look at Clara, and holy shit, watching her face drain of color was like watching a time-lapse video of someone aging 30 years in 30 seconds. Her skin went from its usual healthy glow to the kind of pale you see on people who've just received some seriously bad news from their doctor. The confident, manipulative woman who'd walked into this courtroom was rapidly being replaced by someone who looked like they'd just realized they were standing in the middle of a minefield wearing tap shoes. But the judge wasn't done. Oh no, he was just getting warmed up, and apparently my dear wife had provided him with plenty of material to work with. The next message hit the courtroom like a verbal bomb that made the first one look like a gentle love tap. 2 months of rejection will weaken him. He'll be desperate when I push for financial control. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a wave of collective horror mixed with morbid fascination. This wasn't just about a marriage gone wrong anymore. This was about calculated manipulation that had been planned from the very beginning. The people sitting in those uncomfortable wooden benches weren't just witnessing a divorce. They were getting a front-row seat to the complete unmasking of someone who'd turned marriage into a long-term con game. Clara's mouth was opening and closing like a fish that had been yanked out of water and was desperately trying to figure out how to breathe air. The woman who always had a quick comeback, a clever deflection, or a perfectly crafted lie ready to deploy was suddenly speechless. It was honestly fascinating to watch someone who'd built their entire existence around manipulation realize that they'd finally been out-manipulated. Her lawyer looked like he was seriously considering whether his law degree came with some kind of warranty that would let him return it and get into a less soul-crushing profession. The poor bastard was shuffling through his papers with the desperate energy of someone trying to find a life preserver on a sinking ship. But there's no legal precedent for defending someone against their own stupidly incriminating text messages. Then Clara found her voice, and what came out was exactly the kind of pathetic damage control you'd expect from someone whose master plan had just been exposed to the world. She started stammering something about how these were just jokes between friends, how everyone says things they don't mean when they're venting, how I was taking everything out of context and being vindictive. Her voice was getting higher and more frantic with each word, like a car engine that's been pushed way past its limits and is about to blow up spectacularly. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cracking like thin ice under pressure. "These messages are being taken completely out of context. Women say things to their friends when they're frustrated that they don't actually mean. It's just girl talk. We were just blowing off steam. And my husband is using private conversations to make me look like some kind of monster." The desperation in her voice was so thick you could have cut it with a knife and served it for dinner. She was throwing out every possible excuse she could think of, hoping that something, anything, would stick long enough to create reasonable doubt. But here's the thing about digital evidence. It doesn't really care about your feelings or your desperate attempts to reframe reality. The judge looked at her with the kind of expression that judges, probably perfect over years of dealing with people who think they can talk their way out of anything. It was a look that said, "I've heard every excuse in the book, and yours doesn't even make it to the footnotes." He held up the papers containing her messages like they were Exhibit A in a murder trial. "Mrs. Hale," he said, and the way he emphasized Mrs. made it sound like he was questioning whether she even deserved to use my last name. "These messages show clear premeditation and intent to defraud. They detail a specific plan to manipulate your husband emotionally and financially. This isn't girl talk. This is evidence of marriage fraud." The courtroom was buzzing now with the kind of energy you get when people realize they're witnessing something that's going to be talked about for years. Cell phones were discreetly appearing as people tried to capture this moment for their social media feeds, because apparently even someone's complete life destruction needs to be shared with the internet. Clara was looking around the courtroom like she was searching for someone, anyone, who might believe her increasingly ridiculous explanations. But the thing about truth is that it has this annoying habit of being pretty damn obvious once it's laid out in black and white. Her own words were condemning her more effectively than any lawyer could have managed. Her confidence, which had been her primary weapon throughout our entire relationship, was now completely shattered. The woman who'd always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else had finally been caught flat-footed, and watching her realize that she had absolutely no way out of this situation was more satisfying than I'd ever imagined it could be. You know that feeling when you're playing poker and you've been holding onto a royal flush while everyone else thinks they're hot shit with their mediocre hands? That's exactly how I felt as I watched Clara squirm in her designer suit, desperately trying to convince the judge that her text messages were just innocent girl talk. The woman was practically melting down faster than ice cream on a Phoenix sidewalk in July, but I wasn't done with her yet. Not even close. I had one more card to play, and this one was going to be the ace that would completely obliterate any chance she had of walking away from this train wreck with so much as a penny to her name. The beautiful irony of it all was that Clara had basically handed me the weapon I needed to destroy her. She'd been so eager to get me to sign everything quickly that she'd never bothered to actually read what she was having me agree to. buried in our marriage paperwork, hidden among all the standard legal bullshit that most people just skim through like they're agreeing to iTunes terms and conditions, was a little addendum that Clara had rushed me to sign right before our wedding. At the time, she'd played it off as just some boring legal formality that her family's lawyer had insisted on. You know, the kind of tedious paperwork that makes your eyes glaze over and makes you want to just sign whatever and get on with your life. It's just standard stuff, she'd said with that sweet smile that I now realized was about as genuine as a $3 bill. My parents' attorney is super paranoid about protecting family assets. You know how lawyers are. They make everything way more complicated than it needs to be. She'd laughed it off like it was just another annoying adult responsibility we had to deal with, like getting our taxes done or remembering to change the oil in our cars. But here's the thing about me. I might be trusting, but I'm not completely stupid. Something about the way she was rushing me through the signing process felt off, like when a used car salesman keeps trying to hurry you into making a decision before you can think too hard about whether you really need that extended warranty. So I'd quietly taken a copy of that addendum to my own lawyer a few weeks before the wedding, just to make sure I wasn't accidentally signing away my firstborn child or agreeing to give her my kidney if she ever needed it. My lawyer, a sharp guy named Davidson who charged by the hour but was worth every damn penny, had read through the thing with the kind of thorough attention that Clara clearly hadn't expected anyone to give it. When he finished, he'd looked up at me with this expression that was somewhere between impressed and concerned. "Marcus," he'd said, leaning back in his expensive leather chair, "this is either the work of someone who's incredibly naive about how prenups work, or someone who's trying to pull off one of the most elaborate self-destructions I've ever seen. This addendum basically says that if your marriage is dissolved due to fraud or deception on her part, she forfeits all financial claims and has to return every gift, every dollar of support, everything." At the time, I'd figured it was just overly cautious legal language designed to protect both of us from potential gold diggers or fortune hunters. I mean, who the hell would knowingly sign something that could completely screw them over if they were planning to commit fraud? It seemed like the kind of clause that would only come into play in some ridiculous soap opera scenario that would never happen in real life. But now, sitting in this courtroom watching Clara's carefully constructed world collapse around her like a house of cards in a tornado, I realized that she'd essentially written her own death warrant and handed me the pen to sign it. The woman had been so confident in her ability to manipulate me that she'd never considered the possibility that her scheme might backfire spectacularly. I nodded to my lawyer again, and he stood up with the kind of dramatic flair that you usually only see in courtroom movies. "Your Honor, I'd like to present additional evidence that's directly relevant to this case." He handed over another set of documents to the bailiff, and I watched Clara's face go from pale to absolutely ashen as she realized that somehow this nightmare was about to get even worse for her. The judge took the papers and began reading through them with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades untangling the legal messes that people create for themselves. As his eyes moved across the page, I could see his eyebrows gradually rising higher and higher, like he was reading something that was either completely brilliant or absolutely insane. "This is interesting," the judge said, which in lawyer speak basically translates to "holy shit, you're not going to believe this." He looked up from the papers and fixed Clara with a stare that could have frozen hell over. "Mrs. Hale, are you familiar with the contents of this addendum to your marriage contract?" Clara was now looking like someone who'd just realized they'd been playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun. Her mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out, like she was trying to speak underwater or had suddenly forgotten how human language worked. Her lawyer was frantically flipping through his own copies of the paperwork, probably wondering how the hell he'd missed something this significant. "The addendum clearly states," the judge continued, his voice carrying the weight of legal finality, "that if this marriage is dissolved due to fraud or deception on the part of either party, the guilty party forfeits all financial claims and must return any gifts or financial support received during the relationship." The courtroom was now so quiet you could have heard someone thinking too loudly. Clara was staring at the judge like he was speaking in ancient Sumerian, unable to process the fact that her own greed and overconfidence had led her to sign what was essentially a confession and a punishment all rolled into one neat legal package. "Your Honor," Clara's lawyer finally managed to stammer, probably realizing that his client had just been revealed as someone who'd played herself harder than anyone in the history of legal proceedings. My client may not have fully understood the implications of, but the judge cut him off with a wave of his hand that said, "Save it for someone who gives a damn." The document is clear, and your client's own text messages provide ample evidence of fraudulent intent. This contract is legally binding and enforceable, and that's when Clara completely lost it. Here's the thing about family scandals. They spread faster than gossip at a high school reunion and hit twice as hard as reality TV drama. The courtroom defeat was just the opening act of Clara's personal apocalypse. What happened next was like watching dominoes fall, except each domino was a relationship she'd spent years building, and they were all tumbling down with the kind of spectacular destruction that makes you want to grab popcorn and settle in for the show. Word spread through Clara's family network with the efficiency of a military operation and the subtlety of a nuclear explosion. Within 24 hours of that gavel coming down, every aunt, uncle, cousin, and family friend knew exactly what had transpired in that courtroom. Social media made sure of that, because apparently, someone had been live tweeting the whole damn thing like it was the Super Bowl of divorce proceedings. Clara's parents, Robert and Margaret Thornton, had spent the better part of 2 years bragging to anyone who would listen about their daughter's perfect marriage. These were the kind of people who turned every conversation into an opportunity to humble brag about their successful children, the type who could somehow work Clara's accomplishments into a discussion about the weather or the price of gas. They'd been dining out on the story of how their brilliant daughter had married such a successful, stable man, me, and how they'd raised such a wonderful child who knew how to pick winners. Now they were sitting in their pristine suburban home, probably staring at their phones in horror as the notifications kept rolling in. Friends, neighbors, and business associates were all sending them links to news articles, social media posts, and probably a few choice memes about their daughter's spectacular downfall. The same people who'd been forced to listen to their bragging for months were now getting front row seats to their humiliation. I heard through the grapevine, and let me tell you, that grapevine was working overtime. That the first family confrontation happened at what was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday dinner. You know the kind. Fancy china, carefully prepared roast, everyone sitting around pretending they actually enjoy spending time together. Except this time, instead of discussing the weather or complaining about politicians, they were dealing with the fact that their golden child had just been exposed as a world-class fraud. Clara's Uncle Frank, a guy who'd apparently never learned the art of subtlety or tact, was the first one to really let her have it. Picture this, a 60-something construction contractor who'd built his life on hard work and honest dealing, suddenly finding out that his niece had turned marriage into a get-rich-quick scheme. The man had probably never been more disgusted with another human being in his entire life. "You've disgraced us all," he'd reportedly said, and according to the family members who witnessed this verbal assassination, he'd slammed his fist on that expensive dining room table hard enough to make the good china jump. The same table where Clara had probably sat as a kid, learning about family values and the importance of integrity, was now the scene of her complete character assassination by her own blood relatives. But Uncle Frank was just getting warmed up. Apparently, the man had been saving up years of opinions about Clara's entitled attitude, and this scandal had finally given him permission to let it all out. He'd gone on a rant about how she'd embarrassed the entire family name, how she'd made them all look like they'd raised a sociopathic con artist, and how he was ashamed to share DNA with someone who could be so calculating and heartless. The rest of the family just sat there in stunned silence, probably trying to process the fact that their Sunday dinner had turned into an episode of Jerry Springer. Clara's mother, who'd spent decades perfecting the art of appearing refined and proper, was apparently crying into her napkin, while her father looked like he was seriously considering whether it was too late to legally disown a 30-something daughter. Her brother Daniel, who'd always looked up to Clara like she was some kind of genius who had life figured out better than everyone else, stopped speaking to her entirely. This was a guy who used to call her for advice about everything from job interviews to which brand of laundry detergent to buy. He genuinely believed that Clara was this brilliant strategist who could navigate any situation with grace and intelligence. Now he was realizing that his role model was actually a manipulative fraud who'd been playing games with people's emotions for personal profit. The hero worship he'd carried for his older sister had been replaced by the kind of disgust you usually reserve for finding out your favorite restaurant has been serving expired meat for months. He'd apparently told other family members that he felt like an idiot for ever thinking Clara was someone worth admiring. Even her mother, who'd spent Clara's entire life making excuses for her daughter's behavior and defending her against any criticism, had finally reached her breaking point. Margaret Thornton, a woman who'd perfected the art of passive-aggressive support and had probably never said a harsh word about Clara in public, was now admitting in whispered conversations with relatives that her daughter had completely destroyed her life through pure greed and stupidity. "I don't understand how we raised someone who could be so calculating," she'd apparently confided to Clara's Aunt Susan during a phone call that was definitely not meant to be overheard. "The Clara I thought I knew would never have done something like this. I feel like I don't even know my own daughter anymore." The family that had once pushed Clara to marry for status and security, because let's be honest, they were probably the ones who'd planted those ideas in her head in the first place, were now treating her like a pariah who'd brought shame upon the entire bloodline. The same people who'd encouraged her to find a husband with good financial prospects were now horrified that she'd taken their advice to such a twisted extreme. Christmas invitations were being quietly rescinded. Family group chats were going silent whenever Clara tried to participate. The woman who'd once been the center of attention at every family gathering was now being systematically excluded from the very social circle that had shaped her into the person she'd become. The irony was so thick you could have served it for dessert. If you think family betrayal hurts, wait until you see what happens when your so-called friends discover you've been treating them like unwitting accomplices in your elaborate fraud scheme. Clara's social circle didn't just abandon her. They turned on her with the vicious efficiency of a pack of wolves who'd suddenly realized they'd been harboring a rabid member all along. It was honestly beautiful to watch, in the same way that a controlled demolition is beautiful when you're watching some ugly building get reduced to rubble. The irony of the whole situation was that Clara's friends were the very same people she'd been bragging to in those incriminating text messages. These were the women she'd confided in, laughed with, and apparently used as her personal cheering section while she was orchestrating my emotional destruction. They were the ones who'd received those screenshots that ended up being read aloud in court, the messages where she detailed her master plan to manipulate me into financial submission. Now, imagine being one of those friends and suddenly realizing that you'd been an accessory to someone's scheme to commit marriage fraud. These women weren't just embarrassed. They were pissed off in the way that only betrayed friends can be. The kind of anger that makes people do things like screenshot every conversation they've ever had with you and share them in group chats with captions like, "Can you believe I thought this psycho was my friend?" The screenshots of Clara's original messages spread through their social circle faster than a celebrity death hoax on Twitter. Every woman in their friend group was suddenly seeing exactly what Clara really thought of marriage, commitment, and basic human decency. They were getting a behind-the-scenes look at how someone they trusted had been laughing about manipulating another human being for financial gain. Sarah Martinez, who'd been Clara's maid of honor and had probably spent weeks helping plan our wedding, was apparently the first one to realize she'd been played. According to the gossip network that was somehow more efficient than the FBI, Sarah had called Clara within hours of the courtroom story breaking and absolutely destroyed her over the phone. "You made me complicit in this," Sarah had reportedly screamed, her voice carrying the kind of fury that comes from realizing you've been used by someone you considered a close friend. "I helped you plan a wedding that was basically an elaborate con job. I stood up there beside you while you were lying to everyone, including me. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel?" But Sarah wasn't done. Apparently, she'd spent the next 20 minutes detailing exactly how Clara's deception had made her question every conversation they'd ever had, every piece of advice Clara had given her, and every moment of their friendship. She'd ended the call by telling Clara that she never wanted to see or hear from her again, and that if Clara ever tried to contact her, she'd be forwarding everything directly to my lawyer. The group chat that had once been Clara's primary source of validation and support turned into what could only be described as a digital public execution. Messages were flying back and forth faster than insults at a political debate, with each friend trying to outdo the others in expressing their disgust and outrage at being deceived. Jennifer Chun, who'd always been the most diplomatic member of their friend group, was apparently the one who really drove the knife home. Clara, she'd written in a message that was immediately screenshot and shared with everyone who'd listen. I've been thinking about all the times you complained about Marcus, all the times you made him sound like he was being unreasonable or demanding. Now I realize you were just laying the groundwork for your victim narrative. That's sociopathic behavior. The beautiful thing about female friendships is that when they go nuclear, they really go nuclear. These weren't just casual acquaintances cutting ties. These were women who'd shared secrets, supported each other through breakups, celebrated promotions together, and probably knew where all the bodies were buried in each other's lives. When that level of intimacy gets weaponized against you, it's like getting hit by a freight train made of pure social destruction. Marissa Thompson, Clara's closest friend and the person she'd probably trusted most in the world, delivered what had to be the most devastating blow of all. Marissa was the kind of friend who'd been there through every major life event, the one Clara called when she needed advice, support, or just someone to listen to her complain about whatever was bothering her that week. Their final conversation, which Marissa apparently shared with multiple people because she was so disgusted, was the kind of friendship assassination that leaves no survivors. "You destroyed yourself, Clara," Marissa had said, her voice cold enough to freeze boiling water. "Don't call me again. Don't text me. Don't even think about trying to explain this away or make excuses. You're not the person I thought you were, and I'm ashamed that I ever called you my friend." The rejection from Marissa hit Clara harder than everything else combined, because Marissa had been her rock, her confidant, the one person she'd always been able to count on to take her side no matter what. Losing that relationship was like losing a limb, sudden, shocking, and permanently life-altering. But the social media aspect of Clara's downfall was where things got really brutal. These women didn't just cut ties privately. They made sure everyone knew exactly why they were distancing themselves from Clara. Instagram stories, Facebook posts, subtle Twitter subtweets, and group chat screenshots were flying around like confetti at a parade celebrating Clara's social death. Walking into parties became an exercise in public humiliation for Clara. The same social events where she'd once been the center of attention, holding court with her witty observations and carefully curated stories, now featured her as the main topic of conversation, but not in a good way. People would literally stop talking when she walked into a room, not out of respect, but because they were all discussing her latest scandal and didn't want her to overhear the particularly brutal details. The whispers followed her everywhere. "That's the woman who tried to scam her husband. Can you believe she planned the whole thing from the beginning? I heard she's completely broke now and her family won't even talk to her." The gossip mill was working overtime, and Clara was the primary ingredient being ground up for everyone's entertainment. Her social media feeds, which had once been carefully curated showcases of her fabulous life, became ghost towns of engagement. You know what they say about karma being a bitch? Well, karma apparently has a PhD in thorough destruction and a specialization in making sure no stone is left unturned when it comes to delivering justice. Clara thought her workplace would be some kind of sanctuary from the shitstorm that was engulfing every other aspect of her life, but she was about as wrong as someone who brings a knife to a gunfight or tries to use Internet Explorer in 2025. Clara worked at Henderson & Associates, one of those mid-sized consulting firms that thrives on maintaining an impeccable reputation and attracts clients who are willing to pay premium prices for the privilege of working with reputable professionals. These are the kind of places where your personal brand is almost as important as your actual job performance, where networking events are basically mandatory social functions, and where office gossip travels faster than bad news at a family reunion. The thing about professional environments in today's hyperconnected world is that scandals don't stay private for long, especially when they involve fraud, court proceedings, and the kind of juicy details that make people forget about whatever Netflix series they were binge-watching. Within 48 hours of the courtroom drama, Clara's professional life was about to become as toxic as a nuclear waste dump. It started with the whispers, because that's how these things always begin in corporate America. Colleagues who'd once exchanged pleasantries about weekend plans and complained about Monday morning meetings were now huddled around coffee machines and water coolers, discussing Clara's spectacular personal implosion in the kind of hushed tones usually reserved for discussing layoffs or sexual harassment scandals. "Did you hear about Clara Hale?" became the opening line of every office conversation that week. The story was spreading through the building like wildfire in a drought, with each retelling adding new details and increasingly horrified reactions. People were pulling up court records on their phones during lunch breaks, sharing screenshots of news articles in group texts, and basically turning Clara's downfall into the most entertaining thing to happen in their office since the time someone accidentally replied all to a company-wide email with their resignation letter. The hallway conversations were brutal in their casual cruelty. Clara would walk past groups of coworkers who would suddenly stop talking and watch her with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for watching car accidents or reality TV train wrecks. These were people she'd worked alongside for years, shared projects with, maybe even grabbed drinks with after particularly stressful deadlines. Now they were looking at her like she was some kind of exotic zoo animal that had suddenly revealed itself to be a dangerous predator. Her direct supervisor, Michael Patterson, was probably having nightmares about the potential PR disaster that was now sitting in his department. Patterson was the kind of middle manager who'd spent his entire career carefully avoiding anything that might reflect poorly on his judgment or leadership abilities. Having an employee exposed as a marriage fraudster was definitely not the kind of resume builder he'd been hoping for. The first real sign that Clara's professional life was circling the drain came when she was quietly removed from client-facing projects. Suddenly, the presentations she'd been scheduled to give were being reassigned to other team members with flimsy excuses about workload redistribution and strategic realignment. The clients she'd been cultivating relationships with for months were being handed off to colleagues who probably couldn't believe their luck at inheriting such high-value accounts. But the real professional death blow came at the quarterly networking event that Henderson and Associates hosted for their biggest clients and industry partners. This was the kind of schmoozy corporate gathering where deals get made over overpriced cocktails and people exchange business cards like they're trading Pokemon cards. Clara had always thrived at these events, using her charm and wit to build the kind of professional relationships that translated into revenue and career advancement. This time, walking into that networking event was like stepping into a lion's den while wearing a meat suit. The entire room seemed to shift when she entered, conversations pausing mid-sentence as people recognized her from the news coverage and social media discussions that had been circulating all week. The kind of attention she was getting wasn't the respectful recognition she was used to. It was the rubbernecking curiosity of people watching a celebrity meltdown in real time. James Morrison, a potential client she'd been courting for months, approached her near the bar with a directness that was both refreshing and absolutely devastating. "Aren't you the woman who tried to scam your husband?" he asked, loud enough for half the room to hear. The man didn't even try to lower his voice or pretend to be diplomatic about it. He was genuinely curious about whether he was talking to the person whose marriage fraud had become water cooler conversation across the entire industry. The silence that followed his question was so complete you could have heard someone's career dying. Every conversation in their immediate vicinity stopped as people turned to watch Clara's response, probably hoping for some kind of dramatic confession or meltdown that they could share on LinkedIn later as a cautionary tale about professional integrity. Clara's response was about as effective as trying to put out a forest fire with a squirt gun. She stammered something about misunderstandings and legal complications, but Morrison had already checked out of the conversation mentally. He was looking at her with the kind of expression people get when they realize they've been talking to someone who might be fundamentally untrustworthy in business dealings. "I think we'll be going with a different firm for our consulting needs," Morrison said, his tone carrying the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "We prefer to work with organizations that demonstrate consistent ethical standards." He walked away without another word, leaving Clara standing there like someone who'd just been publicly dumped at their own wedding. The ripple effects of that conversation spread through the networking event faster than gossip in a small town. Other potential clients who'd been considering Henderson and Associates were suddenly having second thoughts about working with a firm that employed someone who'd been exposed as a fraud. Clara's presence wasn't just failing to generate business. It was actively costing the company money and reputation. Her colleagues were shooting her looks that ranged from embarrassed sympathy to outright disgust. These were people who understood that their professional reputations were directly tied to the company's image, and Clara had become a walking liability that threatened everyone's career prospects. Picture this. A woman who once lived like she was the star of her own reality show suddenly finding herself cast as the tragic villain in a cautionary tale that nobody wants to watch. Clara's fall from grace wasn't just spectacular. It was the kind of comprehensive life destruction that makes you wonder if the universe has a sick sense of humor and really enjoys watching people who think they're smarter than everyone else get their comeuppance served ice cold with a side of public humiliation. Isolated from family, abandoned by friends, and professionally blacklisted faster than a communist during the Red Scare, Clara was experiencing what you might call the full karma experience package. The woman who'd spent years building what she thought was an unshakable social empire had watched it crumble faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. And now she was left sitting in the ruins wondering how the hell everything had gone so spectacularly wrong. The most satisfying part of this whole situation, and yeah, I'll admit I was enjoying every single second of it, was hearing through the grapevine about her dramatic change in living circumstances. Clara had gone from living in our beautiful suburban home with its granite countertops, walk-in closets, and the kind of neighborhood where people actually watered their lawns, to renting some sad little apartment on the edge of town that probably came furnished with a refrigerator from the Clinton administration and carpet that had seen better decades. This wasn't just downsizing. This was free-falling from first class to the cargo hold of life. The woman who'd been used to shopping at boutiques where they knew her name and brought her champagne while she tried on designer dresses was now probably clipping coupons and shopping at discount stores where the fluorescent lighting made everyone look like extras from a zombie movie. The reports I was getting from mutual acquaintances painted a picture of someone who'd gone from Instagram influencer to tragic hermit in record time. Clara had completely stopped posting those carefully curated photos of her fabulous life that used to make her followers feel inadequate about their own existence. Her social media presence, which had once been a nonstop highlight reel of designer outfits, expensive dinners, and exotic vacation destinations, had gone dark like a restaurant that's gone out of business but forgot to change their Google listing. The silence was deafening in the most beautiful way possible. This was a woman who'd built her entire identity around projecting success and superiority, who'd never met a mirror she didn't want to pose in front of or a social gathering she couldn't turn into her personal spotlight moment. Now she was living like some kind of modern-day hermit, probably spending her days binge-watching Netflix shows about other people's more interesting lives and ordering takeout from places that definitely didn't accept American Express. But the real kicker was hearing about her emotional state from people who'd accidentally run into her around town. These weren't close friends checking up on her. Remember, she didn't have any of those left. These were random acquaintances, former coworkers, and people who'd known her socially but weren't invested enough in her well-being to get caught up in the drama. According to these secondhand reports, Clara had become the kind of person who cried often and begged anyone who would listen to hear her side of the story. The woman who'd once commanded attention wherever she went was now desperately trying to get people to pay attention to her sob story about how she'd been misunderstood, how the whole situation had been blown out of proportion, and how she was actually the victim in all of this. Rachel Davies, someone who'd worked with Clara at a previous job and hadn't spoken to her in over a year, told me about running into her at a grocery store that was definitely several steps down from the organic markets Clara used to frequent. She looked terrible, Rachel had said, shaking her head with the kind of pity you'd reserve for seeing a former celebrity working at a gas station. Her hair was a mess, she wasn't wearing makeup, and she was wearing sweatpants that looked like she'd been sleeping in them for a week. But the appearance wasn't even the most pathetic part. Apparently, Clara had cornered Rachel in the cereal aisle and launched into this desperate monologue about how everyone had misunderstood the situation, how Marcus, that would be me, had manipulated the evidence to make her look bad, and how she was actually the victim of an elaborate scheme to destroy her reputation. She was crying right there between the Cheerios and the Lucky Charms. Rachel had told me, probably enjoying the irony of Clara having a breakdown in the most mundane possible location. She kept saying that people didn't understand the whole story, that there were things about Marcus that nobody knew, and that she'd been trapped in an impossible situation. The desperation in Clara's voice had apparently been so intense that other shoppers were starting to stare and whisper among themselves. Rachel, who was just trying to buy groceries and get on with her day, had to basically extract herself from the conversation like she was escaping from a particularly aggressive timeshare presentation. Similar stories started popping up from other people around town. Clara apparently had a pattern of approaching anyone who showed even the slightest hint of familiarity, then launching into these exhausting attempts to rehabilitate her image or gain sympathy for her situation. She was like a broken record of self-pity, constantly trying to rewrite the narrative of what had happened and convince people that she deserved compassion rather than condemnation. The woman who'd once thrived on being envied was now reduced to begging for basic human sympathy from people who barely knew her. She'd gone from being the person everyone wanted to be around to being the person everyone actively avoided, like she was carrying some kind of social disease that might be contagious. Without me, without my financial support, without my social connections, and without the lifestyle I'd provided, Clara had been forced to confront the reality that she'd built her entire existence on a foundation made of other people's resources and goodwill. When all of that was stripped away, what was left was just a sad, lonely woman sitting in a crappy apartment, surrounded by the consequences of her own greed and manipulation. You know how they say you can't escape your past? Well, apparently the same rule applies to your ex-wife, especially when she's been reduced to haunting the same public spaces as normal people instead of hiding away in whatever rock she's been living under since her life imploded. I was having a perfectly pleasant evening at Romano's, this decent Italian place that serves pasta that doesn't taste like it came from a box and wine that doesn't give you an instant headache. When fate decided to serve up a side dish of poetic justice that I definitely hadn't ordered, I'd been looking forward to this dinner all week. After months of dealing with lawyers, court proceedings, and the general clusterfuck that had been my marriage and subsequent divorce, I was finally starting to feel like a human being again instead of a character in some twisted soap opera. The restaurant was busy but not crowded, filled with the kind of comfortable chatter and clinking silverware that makes you remember why people actually enjoy going out to eat. I was halfway through what had to be the best chicken parmesan I'd had in years, actually relaxing for the first time in months, when I spotted her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, because the woman sitting alone at a corner table looked like Clara's significantly less successful sister who'd been hit by a bus and then dragged through a department store clearance rack backwards. Clara was sitting by herself, which should have been my first clue that something was seriously wrong with this picture. This was a woman who'd never eaten alone in public in her entire life. She was always surrounded by friends, colleagues, or at minimum some poor soul she'd cornered into listening to her latest dramatic story. Seeing her alone was like seeing a peacock with all its feathers plucked off, pathetic and vaguely disturbing. Her hair, which had always been perfectly styled like she was ready for a magazine photo shoot at any moment, looked like she'd been sleeping on it for about 3 days straight without bothering to look in a mirror. The designer outfits that had once made her look like she'd stepped off a runway had been replaced by what could charitably be described as discount rack chic, the kind of clothes you buy when you're more concerned with covering your body than making any kind of fashion statement. But it was her posture that really drove home how far she'd fallen. Clara was hunched over her phone like it was the last source of warmth in a frozen wasteland, scrolling with the desperate intensity of someone checking to see if anyone, anywhere, still gave a damn about her existence. The confident, commanding presence that had once made her the center of attention in any room had been replaced by the deflated posture of someone who'd been thoroughly defeated by life. I was actually debating whether I could finish my meal and escape without her noticing me, because honestly, I was having such a nice evening and didn't need it ruined by whatever fresh hell Clara might try to drag me into. When she looked up from her phone and our eyes met across the restaurant, the recognition hit her face like a physical blow, and for a second I thought she might actually faint right there in her sad little corner booth. But then something shifted in her expression, some desperate kind of hope mixed with panic, and I knew I was about to get treated to a performance that would make daytime television look subtle by comparison. She practically launched herself out of her seat and rushed over to my table with the kind of frantic energy you usually see in people who are drowning and have just spotted a life preserver. The other diners were starting to notice the commotion, probably wondering if they were about to witness some kind of public breakdown that they could post on their social media accounts later. "Marcus, please, just a minute," she said. and her voice was already cracking like she was gearing up for the kind of dramatic scene that would make Oscar winners jealous. Please, I just need 1 minute of your time. I looked up at her, taking in the full scope of her transformation from successful manipulation artist to whatever this sad creature standing beside my table was supposed to be. Part of me felt something that might have been pity, if pity wasn't completely overshadowed by the satisfaction of seeing someone who tried to destroy my life getting exactly what they deserved. I've lost everything, she continued, apparently taking my silence as permission to continue with what was clearly going to be the performance of her lifetime. My family has completely disowned me. They won't take my calls. They've uninvited me from every family gathering, and my own mother told me she's ashamed to have raised someone like me. Tears were starting to stream down her face, and I had to give her credit. She was really committing to this role of the tragic victim who'd been wronged by the cruel world. The restaurant was getting quieter as other diners tried to pretend they weren't eavesdropping on what was obviously going to be some premium dinner theater. My friends are all gone, she sobbed, her voice getting higher and more desperate with each word. People I've known for years, people I thought would always be there for me. They've all just disappeared. They won't return my calls. They've blocked me on social media, and when I tried to show up at Jessica's birthday party last month, they literally asked me to leave. She was really getting into the swing of things now, gesturing wildly like she was auditioning for a particularly melodramatic stage production. At work, they treat me like I don't exist. I used to be respected there, Marcus. I was good at my job. I brought in clients. I was making real contributions. Now they've basically sidelined me completely. I sit at my desk all day with nothing meaningful to do, and I can hear people whispering about me whenever I walk by. The desperation in her voice was becoming almost palpable, filling the space between us like smoke from a house fire. I destroyed us, Marcus. I destroyed everything we had together, everything we could have been. I was stupid and greedy, and I thought I was so much smarter than everyone else, but I wasn't. I was just an idiot who threw away the best thing that ever happened to her. Then came the big finish, the moment she'd probably been rehearsing in her bathroom mirror for weeks. Please, I need another chance. I know I don't deserve it. I know I have no right to ask, but I'm begging you. I can't live like this anymore. The weeks following that restaurant encounter were like watching the final act of a tragedy where the main character refuses to accept that the curtain has already fallen. Clara's desperate plea for forgiveness had been met with the kind of cold, calculated response that she probably should have expected from someone whose life she tried to systematically destroy. But apparently delusion dies hard when you're drowning in the consequences of your own stupidity. You made your choice, I told her that night, standing up from my table with the kind of calm finality that comes from finally having the upper hand in a situation that had once made me feel powerless. Now you're living with it. Those 8 words contained months of hurt, betrayal, and righteous anger distilled into their purest form. I'd walked away from that restaurant feeling like I'd just closed the final chapter of the worst book I'd ever been forced to read. But Clara, apparently, wasn't ready to accept that the story was over. In the weeks that followed, she launched what could only be described as a full-scale assault on my peace of mind, using every form of communication available to modern humanity in a desperate attempt to convince me that somehow, someway, there was still a chance for redemption in this burning wreckage of what had once been our marriage. It started with text messages, the kind of pathetic, rambling novels that people write when they're having emotional breakdowns at 3 in the morning and think that quantity of words can somehow compensate for quality of character. These weren't the short, manipulative messages she used to send during our marriage. These were epic dissertations of self-pity and desperation that would have made Russian literature look cheerful by comparison. Marcus, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I can't stop thinking about what you said at the restaurant. Read one message that was apparently just the opening line of what turned into a 3,000-word manifesto about her newfound self-awareness and desire to make amends. Reading these messages was like watching someone perform emotional surgery on themselves without anesthesia, painful, messy, and ultimately unsuccessful. When the text messages failed to generate any response from me, because honestly, what was I supposed to say to someone who'd spent paragraphs explaining how she'd finally understood the depth of her mistakes and was ready to do whatever it takes to earn back my trust? She escalated to emails. These weren't the brief, professional communications that civilized people send to their ex-spouses about dividing assets or finalizing paperwork. These were the kind of epic emotional outpourings that would have made a telenovela writer proud. The subject lines alone were enough to make me question Clara's grip on reality. Please read this. It's important. I know you hate me, but please give me 5 minutes. The truth about everything that happened. And my personal favorite. I'm not the person you think I am. That last one was particularly rich, considering that the person I thought she was had been revealed through her own text messages and confirmed by a judge in open court. But Clara's digital harassment campaign was just the warm-up act for the main event that was about to unfold. When emails failed to generate the response she was desperately seeking, she moved on to phone calls with the persistence of a telemarketer who's been promised a commission on every sale and the desperation of someone who's just realized they're completely alone in the world. The first few calls came at reasonable hours, probably timed for maximum impact when she thought I might actually answer. When those went straight to voicemail. Because I'd learned my lesson about engaging with crazy, she started calling at increasingly desperate intervals. Early morning calls before I left for work, afternoon calls during lunch breaks, evening calls when she probably thought I'd be relaxed and more receptive to her bullshit. Each voicemail was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation disguised as genuine remorse. Marcus, please pick up. I know you're probably screening my calls, but I really need to talk to you about something important. Or, I've been doing a lot of thinking about what went wrong between us, and I think I finally understand why you're so angry. The woman had apparently convinced herself that the problem wasn't her calculated fraud and emotional manipulation, but rather my inability to properly understand her complex emotional motivations. But the real psychological break came on what I now think of as the night of 187 missed calls. A phrase that sounds like it should be the title of a horror movie about technological harassment. I'd gone to bed early after a particularly good day at work, the kind of day that reminded me that life after Clara was actually pretty damn good when you didn't have someone actively trying to sabotage your emotional well-being. I turned my phone on silent and placed it on the nightstand, expecting to wake up to maybe a few work emails and perhaps a text from a friend about weekend plans. What I woke up to instead was a phone that looked like it had been the target of some kind of digital bombing campaign. The notification screen was so full of missed calls that I had to scroll for what felt like minutes just to see them all. 187 missed calls. All from Clara. All between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. The woman had apparently spent the entire night hitting redial like it was some kind of therapeutic activity, probably convinced that if she just kept trying, eventually I'd crack and answer the phone. The voicemails that accompanied this marathon of desperation painted a picture of someone who'd completely lost touch with reality. They started out relatively coherent, more pathetic pleas for forgiveness and explanations of how much she'd changed. But as the night progressed and the calls continued, they devolved into increasingly unhinged rants about how I was being unreasonable, how she deserved a chance to explain herself, and how our love was too strong to be destroyed by one mistake. By the end of the sequence, Clara was sobbing into the phone, begging me to remember the good times we'd had together and insisting that the woman who'd planned to manipulate me for financial gain wasn't the real Clara. Apparently, the real Clara was this reformed character who'd learned from her mistakes and was ready to build something beautiful together. I listened to exactly none of these voicemails. I didn't need to hear Clara's version of events or her desperate attempts to rewrite history. The facts were simple. She denied me intimacy, respect, and honesty throughout our marriage, and now life was denying her the security and comfort she thought she was entitled to. The beautiful symmetry of it all was more satisfying than any conversation we could have had. My wife, Father the CEO, introduced me to his rich investors with a mocking tone. This is Thomas. He works in a little office doing Excel work. He'll never be anyone important. Everyone laughed. I did not. This morning, he came looking to reconcile. What he found was my empty office and a note. At the reception desk. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and immediately realize you're the entertainment for the evening? Yeah, that was me, stepping into Gregory Lawson's dining room like a lamb being led to slaughter, except the lamb was wearing a JCPenney suit and had absolutely no clue what was coming. My wife's father, Gregory Lawson, was the kind of man who collected expensive watches like some people collect bottle caps, except his hobby came with a seven-figure price tag and an ego the size of Texas. As CEO of Lawson Holdings, a company that apparently did something important with money and made more money doing it. His entire existence revolved around mahogany boardrooms, country clubs where the membership fee could buy a decent house, and these exclusive dinners where grown men sat around comparing the sizes of their investment portfolios like teenagers bragging about their latest conquests. When he invited me to one of these dinners, I knew damn well it wasn't really an invitation. You don't get invited to Gregory Lawson's inner circle, you get summoned for inspection. It was like being called to the principal's office, except the principal wore $1,000 suits and had the power to make your life miserable at every family gathering for the rest of eternity. The whole setup screamed old money and new arrogance. Crystal glasses that probably cost more than my monthly rent, silverware that looked like it belonged in a museum, and cloth napkins so pristine I was afraid to actually use them. The dining room itself was one of those spaces that whispered, "You don't belong here," in every gleaming surface and perfectly positioned piece of art that I was pretty sure was worth more than my car. The investors were exactly what you'd expect from Gregory's crowd. Men who measured human worth in assets and stock options. Guys who probably had their net worth tattooed on their foreheads if it weren't so tacky. They wore their success like armor, dropping names of companies they owned and deals they'd closed with the casual air of people discussing the weather. These weren't just rich guys. These were the kind of rich guys who made other rich guys feel poor. I tried my best to stay quiet, blending into the expensive wallpaper like some kind of financial chameleon. My strategy was simple. Smile when appropriate, nod thoughtfully when they talked about market trends I barely understood, and pray to whatever deity protects middle-class sons-in-law that I could make it through the evening without saying something that would end up as an anecdote at next year's Christmas party. But Gregory had other plans. Of course he did. The conversation had been flowing as smoothly as the wine, something French and probably older than my last promotion, when suddenly the old bastard stood up. He had that look in his eyes, the same one I'd seen at family barbecues right before he'd start telling stories about his glory days in college football. Glass in hand, Crystal catching the light from that ridiculous chandelier hanging over the table like a weapon of mass illumination. He cleared his throat with the authority of a man who'd never been ignored in his life. "Gentlemen," he announced, and I swear I felt my stomach drop faster than my company's stock options during the last market correction. "I'd like you to meet someone very special." The room went quiet, and I could feel every pair of eyes turning toward me like spotlights at a police lineup. My mouth went dry, and I had this sudden, desperate urge to check if the exits were clearly marked, because something told me I was about to need a quick escape route. "This is Thomas, my son-in-law," Gregory continued, his voice carrying that particular tone that successful men use when they're about to deliver what they think is a punchline. "He works in a little office doing Excel work." He paused for effect, probably savoring the moment like fine wine. "He'll never be anyone important." The room erupted. I'm talking full-blown, knee-slapping, tears in their eyes laughter. These grown men, captains of industry, masters of the universe, were practically falling out of their chairs laughing at Gregory's assessment of my life. It was like watching a pack of hyenas discover a particularly amusing carcass. Except the carcass was my dignity, and it was being devoured in real time. I forced what I hoped passed for a smile, the kind of expression you might make if someone asked you to look pleasant while they slowly pulled out your fingernails. Inside, I could feel something fundamental crack, like the sound ice makes right before it completely gives way. 3 years of quiet contributions, of handling the practical stuff that kept their perfect world running smoothly, of building something that I thought mattered, reduced to a punchline about Excel work and being nobody important. The laughter seemed to go on forever, echoing off the walls of that perfectly appointed dining room while I sat there, frozen in my chair, watching my father-in-law bask in the glow of his audience's appreciation. This wasn't just humiliation. This was performance art, and I was the unwilling star of Gregory Lawson's one-man show titled, "Why My Daughter Married Beneath Her Station." As the chuckles finally died down and the conversation moved on to more important topics, like whose yacht was bigger and which private school was currently most exclusive, I sat there in stunned silence. that fake smile still plastered on my face like a Halloween mask. But inside, something had fundamentally shifted. That crack I'd felt? It wasn't just anger or hurt pride. It was the sound of the last thread of respect I'd held for Gregory Lawson snapping clean in two. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced politeness and strategic silence. I nodded at appropriate moments, made the occasional non-committal sound when directly addressed, and counted the minutes until I could escape this monument to my own inadequacy. But the whole time, one thought kept running through my head like a broken record. Gregory Lawson had no idea what he'd just done. He thought he was putting me in my place, showing his important friends that he was the alpha dog in this particular pack. What he'd actually done was light a fuse that had been waiting 3 years to be ignited. Because here's the thing about quiet people who work in little offices doing Excel work. We notice everything. We remember everything. And when we finally decide we've had enough, we don't make a scene. We make a plan. The ride home from Gregory's mansion was quieter than a funeral procession, and about half as cheerful. Clara sat in the passenger seat of my Honda Civic. Yeah, that's right. We took my car to her father's dinner party because her BMW was making that noise again, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. Like her father hadn't just served up my dignity as the evening's appetizer to a room full of his wealthy cronies. I kept waiting for her to say something. Anything. Maybe an apology, or at least an acknowledgement that what had just happened was completely screwed up. Instead, she was liking Instagram posts and responding to text messages with the kind of casual indifference that made my jaw clench tighter with every passing mile. When we finally pulled into the driveway of our modest 2-bedroom house, the one that suddenly felt like a cardboard box compared to Gregory's sprawling estate, Clara finally looked up from her phone. "You're being awfully quiet," she said, like she was commenting on the weather. "Yeah, well," I muttered, turning off the engine with perhaps a little more force than necessary. "It's been a real enlightening evening," she sighed, one of those long-suffering sighs that wives perfect over time, the kind that suggests you're being unreasonable about something perfectly reasonable. "Thomas, you're not seriously upset about what my father said, are you?" I stared at her for a moment, wondering if we'd been at the same dinner party. "Am I upset that your father introduced me to his business associates as someone who'll never be important? Gee, Clara, I can't imagine why that would bother me." "Oh, come on," she said, already getting out of the car and heading toward the front door. "You know how he is. He was just showing off for his friends. Don't take it so personally. Don't take it so personally. Right? Because having your worth as a human being reduced to a punchline in front of a room full of strangers is just good, clean fun." I followed her inside, watching as she kicked off her designer heels, the ones that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, and headed straight for the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine. "Want some?" she asked, holding up the bottle like we were celebrating something. "No, thanks," I said. "I'm trying to cut back on drowning my sorrows." She rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic." Dramatic. That was rich, coming from someone whose idea of a crisis was running out of her favorite face cream. But I didn't say that. Instead, I stood there in our living room, still wearing that damn JCPenney suit that had felt so inadequate all evening, and tried to process what had just happened. Clara settled onto the couch with her wine, patting the cushion next to her like she was calling a dog. "Come sit with me. Let's watch something mindless and forget about tonight." "Easy for you to say," I said, loosening my tie with hands that were still shaking slightly from anger. "You didn't just get publicly humiliated by your own family." "He's not your family, he's mine," she corrected, as if that somehow made it better. "And you're overreacting. My father was just being, well, my father. You knew what you were getting into when you married me." And there it was. The truth wrapped up in a neat little bow. I had known what I was getting into, hadn't I? 3 years of marriage, and Gregory had never once treated me like anything more than a necessary inconvenience. The guy Clara happened to bring home who wasn't quite rich enough, wasn't quite successful enough, wasn't quite anything enough to deserve his daughter. But here's the thing about knowing something intellectually and having it shoved in your face in front of a room full of strangers. It hits different. It hits harder. It leaves marks. "You know what, Clara?" I said, heading toward the bedroom to get out of that suit that suddenly felt like a costume from a play I never auditioned for. "Maybe I will sleep on the couch tonight." "Don't be ridiculous," she called after me. "You're acting like a child." I grabbed a pillow and one of the throw blankets her mother had given us for our first anniversary, the one that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and set up camp on our sectional sofa. It wasn't the most comfortable sleeping arrangement, but somehow it felt appropriate. The couch where I'd spent countless evenings watching Netflix while Clara chatted with her friends about their shopping trips and spa days. The couch where I'd eaten dinner while working on my laptop, trying to get ahead at that little office job that apparently made me invisible. Clara appeared in the doorway wearing her silk pajamas, arms crossed, looking like a disappointed parent. "This is silly, Thomas. Come to bed." "I'm good here," I said, not looking at her. Wouldn't want to contaminate the sheets with my mediocrity. "Now you're just being mean." "Mean, right?" Because spending an entire evening listening to her father treat me like hired help was the height of kindness. I stared up at the ceiling, counting the little imperfections in the paint job that I'd never noticed before. Funny how you start seeing things differently when your world gets turned upside down. "Clara," I said quietly, still not looking at her. "In 3 years of marriage, have you ever once asked me what I actually do at work?" There was a pause. A long one. The kind that tells you everything you need to know. "You work with spreadsheets," she said finally. "Data analysis or something." "Or something," I repeated. "Yeah, that about sums it up." She stood there for another minute, maybe waiting for me to apologize or come to my senses. When neither of those things happened, she made another one of those sighs and disappeared back into the bedroom. I heard the door close with a soft click that somehow sounded final. And there I was, lying on my own couch in my own house, staring at my own ceiling, feeling like a stranger in my own life. The anger was still there, burning in my chest like heartburn from a bad meal. But underneath, it was something else. Something that felt like clarity. For 3 years, I had been the supporting actor in Clara's life story. The reliable, boring husband who paid half the bills and didn't cause any drama at family gatherings. I had convinced myself that love meant making yourself smaller so the other person could shine brighter. I had accepted Gregory's dismissive comments and Clara's casual indifference because I thought that was what commitment looked like. But lying there in the dark, listening to the house settle around me and the distant sound of Clara getting ready for bed like nothing had changed, I realized something important. I had been living my life like an apology. Like I owed the world an explanation for taking up space. Well, screw that. By the time dawn started creeping through the blinds, painting everything in that gray half-light that makes the world look like a black and white photograph, I had made a decision. Gregory thought I was small, insignificant, destined to remain nobody important. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. You know that moment when you've been slowly drowning for so long that you don't realize you're underwater until someone finally throws you a life preserver? Well, my life preserver came in the form of complete and total rage, and let me tell you, it was exactly the wake-up call I needed. I didn't sleep a damn wink on that couch. Not 1 minute. I spent the entire night staring at the ceiling like it held the answers to life's greatest mysteries, when really all it had were water stains from that time our upstairs neighbor's toilet overflowed, and we had to deal with insurance adjusters who acted like soggy drywall was somehow our fault. But lying there in the dark, listening to Clara sleep peacefully in our bedroom like she hadn't just watched her father publicly execute my dignity, something crystallized in my mind with the kind of clarity that only comes at 3 in the morning when you're questioning every life choice you've ever made. I was done. Not just angry done or temporarily pissed off done, but fundamentally, permanently, existentially done with this bullshit circus that had somehow become my life. When the first light of dawn started creeping through our blinds, the cheap ones from Home Depot that Clara always complained about because they weren't stylish enough, I got up from that couch with the kind of purpose I hadn't felt in 3 years. My back was killing me. My neck had a crick in it that would probably require physical therapy, but my mind was clearer than it had been since the day I said, "I do," to a woman who apparently thought, "I do" meant, "I'll settle for mediocre." Clara was still asleep when I quietly gathered my things. Not everything, mind you. I wasn't planning a permanent escape just yet. But I packed a bag with enough clothes for a few days, my laptop, my phone charger, and that lucky pen I'd gotten when I landed my first real job out of college. You know, back when I still believed that hard work and competence actually mattered to people who weren't paying your salary. I moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to wake the princess who had made it crystal clear that my feelings were less important than her father's ego. It was funny, in that not really funny at all kind of way, how much stuff in that house was actually mine. The coffee maker that Clara never used because she preferred her overpriced lattes. The bookshelf full of novels and business books that she'd never touched because reading was boring. The tools in the garage that had fixed everything from leaky faucets to squeaky doors while she complained about having to call repair people who would charge us a fortune to do things I could handle myself. But I wasn't taking any of that. Not yet. This wasn't about dividing assets or making some grand dramatic statement. This was about getting some space to think without having to look at Clara's face and remember how casually she had dismissed my humiliation. I left a note on the kitchen counter, right next to the fancy espresso machine that Gregory had given us for our second anniversary, the one that cost more than my first car and made coffee that tasted exactly like the stuff from the break room at work. The note was short and to the point. I need time to think. No explanations, no apologies, no promises about when I'd be back. Just the facts, delivered with the kind of emotional detachment that I was pretty sure would drive Clara absolutely insane. Good. Let her wonder for a change. The drive to my younger brother Adrian's apartment took me through parts of town that Gregory Lawson had probably never seen, neighborhoods where people worked with their hands and didn't apologize for it. Adrian lived in one of those complexes that looked like it had been built sometime in the 80s and hadn't been updated since, complete with a parking lot full of pickup trucks, motorcycles, and cars that had personality instead of price tags. Adrian opened his door wearing boxers and a t-shirt that advertised a brewery that had gone out of business 5 years ago, his hair sticking up in about 12 different directions. He took one look at my face, then at the bag in my hand, and stepped aside without saying a word. That's the thing about Adrian. He might not have gone to college or wear suits to work, but the guy could read a situation faster than most people with MBA degrees. Coffee? He asked, padding toward the kitchen in bare feet. God, yes, I said, dropping my bag by the door and looking around his living room. It wasn't much, secondhand furniture, a TV that was definitely not smart, walls covered with posters of bands I'd never heard of and motorcycles he'd never owned. But it felt real in a way that my own house hadn't in a long time. No designer throw pillows, no carefully curated art pieces that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Just a place where a guy could exist without having to justify his existence to anyone else. Adrian handed me a mug that said, "World's Okayest Mechanic," and sat down across from me at his kitchen table, a piece of furniture that had definitely seen better decades, but still managed to be more comfortable than the fancy dining set that Clara had insisted we buy from some boutique furniture store. "So," he said, taking a sip of his coffee and studying my face like a mechanic examining a busted engine. "What did the rich bastard do now?" I told him. All of it. The dinner, the introduction, the laughter, Clara's casual dismissal of the whole thing. Adrian listened without interrupting, his expression getting darker with each detail. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and shook his head. "Jesus, Thomas, that's some premium-grade bullshit right there. Tell me about it," I said, and for the first time in 12 hours, I actually cracked a smile. "Stay as long as you need," Adrian said, and the simple kindness in those words almost broke me. Here was my little brother, the guy who fixed cars for a living and lived paycheck to paycheck, offering me sanctuary without questions or conditions. Meanwhile, my wife of 3 years couldn't even muster up a decent apology for her father's behavior. "Gregory thinks I'm small," I said, staring into my coffee mug like it contained the secrets of the universe. Adrian snorted. "Gregory thinks anyone who doesn't drive a BMW and vacation in the Hamptons is small. That says more about him than it does about you." He was right, of course. But sitting there in Adrian's humble kitchen, drinking coffee that came from a can instead of some artisanal roastery, I realized something important. Gregory Lawson was about to learn that small people can cast very long shadows when they finally decide to stand up. The first few days at Adrian's place were like stepping into an alternate universe where nobody gave a shit about thread counts, wine pairings, or whether your car was this year's model. It was weird as hell, and I'm not gonna lie, it was exactly what I needed. Adrian went to work every morning at 7 sharp, came home covered in grease and motor oil, cracked open a beer, and asked me how my day went like my answer actually mattered. Revolutionary concept, right? I spent most of those first few days walking around his neighborhood, which was about as far from Gregory's gated community as you could get without leaving the state entirely. Kids rode bikes with playing cards clothespin to the spokes, making that clicking sound that took me back to when life was simple and the biggest decision you had to make was whether to have cereal or Pop-Tarts for breakfast. Old guys sat on porches fixing lawn mowers and arguing about baseball like the fate of the world hung in the balance. It was real in a way that felt almost foreign after 3 years of living in Clara's carefully curated bubble of upscale mediocrity. But here's the thing about running away from your problems. Your problems have your phone number, and they're not shy about using it. Clara's first text came on day 2. Don't be dramatic. Just like that. For words that somehow managed to encapsulate everything that was wrong with our marriage. Not, I'm sorry. Not, we need to talk. Not even, are you okay? Just an accusation that my perfectly reasonable response to being publicly humiliated was somehow an overreaction. I stared at that message for about 10 minutes, crafting and deleting responses that ranged from diplomatic to downright nuclear, before finally deciding that silence was the most eloquent response I could offer. Day 3 brought. My father was joking. Right. Because nothing says comedy gold like destroying someone's self-worth in front of a room full of strangers. I was starting to understand why Gregory felt so comfortable treating people like garbage. His own daughter was apparently fine with it. So why shouldn't everyone else be? But then something beautiful started to happen. Something that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so perfectly, poetically just. The calls began on day 4. Thomas. Clara's voice sounded different when she actually had to speak instead of hiding behind text messages. Smaller. Less certain. There's something wrong with the gas line to the stove. It's making this hissing sound, and I don't know who to call. I almost laughed. Almost. The gas line that I had personally inspected and maintained for the past 3 years, the one I'd been meaning to have professionally serviced but kept putting off because we were saving money for more important things, like Clara's monthly spa visits and Gregory's investment advice that never seemed to actually make us any money. Call a plumber, I said. Or maybe ask your father. I'm sure he knows some important people who can fix important gas lines for important people. The line went quiet for a long moment. Thomas, don't be like this. Like what? Unavailable? Funny how that works, isn't it? She hung up. I went back to watching Adrian fix his neighbor's motorcycle in the parking lot, feeling lighter than I had in months. Day 5, the electricity. The breaker keeps tripping in the kitchen, Clara's voicemail said, and I could hear the frustration creeping into her voice. I tried flipping the switch, but it just keeps happening. The refrigerator is making weird noises. The electrical system that I had quietly upgraded and maintained, learning YouTube tutorials and spending weekends crawling around in the crawl space because paying an electrician would have meant Clara couldn't get her nails done twice a month. The system that had been running perfectly for 3 years because I actually gave a damn about keeping our home functional. Day 6 brought the water system crisis. Thomas, I know you're mad, but this is serious. Clara's voice had moved from frustrated to borderline panicked. There's no hot water, and there's water pooling under the water heater. I don't know what to do. The water heater that I had researched, purchased, and installed myself after watching about 50 instructional videos and reading every manual twice. The one that came with a warranty that was registered in my name, with maintenance schedules that I had meticulously followed and documented in a folder that Clara had never bothered to look at. I could picture her standing in our bathroom, staring at the puddle of water, probably wearing one of those silk robes that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, completely helpless in the face of basic home maintenance. It was almost sad. Almost. But here's what really got me. Not once in any of these calls or messages did Clara mention the dinner. Not once did she acknowledge what her father had said or how it had made me feel. Every conversation was about what I could fix, what I could handle, what I could make better for her. Even in crisis mode, I was still just the handy guy who happened to share her bed and split the mortgage payments. Adrian came home that evening to find me sitting at his kitchen table, staring at my phone like it might bite me. Let me guess, he said, grabbing 2 beers from the fridge and sliding one across to me. The princess is discovering that her castle needs maintenance. It's like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion, I said, taking a long pull from the beer. Everything I've been quietly handling for 3 years is suddenly falling apart. And she's just now realizing you actually do stuff? Oh, she's realizing I do stuff. She's just not realizing why I'm not doing it anymore. Adrian laughed, that genuine, unsympathetic laugh that only comes from someone who's never had to pretend their life was something it wasn't. So what's next? The lawnmower gonna break? The garbage disposal gonna start eating itself? As if on cue, my phone buzzed. Another text from Clara. The pool filter isn't working and there are leaves everywhere. Also, I can't find the insurance papers for the house. Where do you keep them? I showed Adrian the message. He nearly choked on his beer. Jesus Christ, Thomas. You weren't just her husband. You were her personal assistant. And that's when it hit me. That's when I realized the beautiful, terrible truth of what was happening. Gregory had spent years treating me like I was invisible, like I was some insignificant little man who didn't matter. Clara had spent our entire marriage taking for granted every single thing I contributed to our life together. But here's the funny thing about being invisible. People don't notice you're gone until everything starts falling apart. Gregory might have laughed at me, called me unimportant, made me the punchline to his joke about successful men and their unsuccessful in-laws. But his empire at home, his daughter's perfect life, her smoothly running household, her comfortable existence, all of that was running on my invisible shoulders. And now those shoulders were somewhere else, holding up someone else's world. Someone who actually appreciated what they were carrying. By day 7 of my stay at Adrian's place, I had developed a routine that felt more natural than anything I'd done in the past 3 years. Wake up when I actually felt rested instead of when an alarm told me to. Drink coffee that came from a regular can instead of some pretentious roastery with a name I couldn't pronounce. Read the news on my phone without Clara complaining that I was ignoring her during breakfast. Simple stuff, really, but it felt like freedom. Adrian and I had settled into this weird rhythm where he'd come home from the shop covered in automotive evidence of an honest day's work, and I'd be sitting at his kitchen table with my laptop, handling the remote work that my little office job actually allowed me to do from anywhere with decent Wi-Fi. Funny how Gregory had never bothered to ask about that particular perk of my supposedly insignificant career. We'd eat dinner. Usually something that came from a box or a can and didn't require a sommelier to properly appreciate, and talk about everything except the elephant in the room, which was fine by me. I wasn't ready for deep conversations about my marriage or my life choices or whatever self-help bullshit Clara was probably reading about how to fix difficult husbands. But Adrian had always been smarter than people gave him credit for. Just because he worked with his hands instead of spreadsheets didn't mean he couldn't read people like instruction manuals. And on that 7th evening, while we were eating pizza that had absolutely zero artisanal ingredients and probably came from a place that didn't even pretend to be organic, he finally said the words that cut deeper than Gregory's public humiliation ever could. So, he said, taking a bite of pizza that dripped grease onto his paper plate in a way that would have given Clara a minor coronary. I've got a question for you. Shoot, I said, grateful for any conversation that didn't involve my phone buzzing with increasingly desperate messages about broken appliances and mysterious household malfunctions. Has Clara or her father ever once asked you what you actually do at your job? I stopped mid-chew, just completely froze with a piece of pepperoni pizza halfway to my mouth, because that question hit me like a sledgehammer to the solar plexus. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew it immediately, completely, and with the kind of crystal clarity that makes you realize you've been lying to yourself for longer than you care to admit. I started, then stopped. Tried again. They know I work with data analysis, and that's not what I asked, Adrian interrupted, and his voice was gentler than I expected. I asked if they've ever actually asked you what you do. Like, shown curiosity about your work. Wanted to know about your projects, your responsibilities, your successes. Any of it. I set down my pizza and really thought about it. 3 years of marriage. Countless family dinners. Holiday gatherings where Gregory held court and everyone pretended his war stories from the business world were fascinating. All those times Clara had asked me about my day, which I had interpreted as genuine interest, but now realized were probably just polite conversation fillers, the conversational equivalent of asking about the weather. The answer was so obvious it was painful. No, never. Adrian nodded like he'd already known what I was going to say. Right. So they don't actually know what you do, what you're good at, or what you contribute at work. They just know it doesn't sound impressive enough for Gregory's taste. Jesus, I muttered, running my hands through my hair. How did I not see that? Because you were too busy trying to prove yourself to people who had already decided you weren't worth understanding, Adrian said, and there wasn't any judgment in his voice. Just facts, delivered with the kind of straightforward honesty that only comes from people who don't have time for bullshit. It's easier to dismiss someone when you don't actually know what they're capable of. He was right, and I hated how right he was. Gregory had spent 3 years making jokes about my Excel work, without ever asking what kind of analysis I did, what systems I managed, or what problems I solved. Clara had spent our entire marriage nodding politely when I mentioned work challenges or successes, but I couldn't remember a single time she'd asked follow-up questions or shown genuine interest in the details of my professional life. To them, I was just the guy who worked in an office and wasn't rich enough to matter. They had never bothered to learn about the projects I led, the certifications I'd earned on my own time, or the money I'd saved my company through process improvements and data optimization. They didn't know about the presentations I'd given to executives, the training programs I'd developed, or the recognition I'd received from people who actually understood what I did for a living. You know what's really screwed up? I said, staring at my half-eaten pizza like it held the answers to life's great mysteries. I've been apologizing for my job for 3 years, making it sound less important than it actually is because I thought that would make them more comfortable. Why the hell would you do that? Because I stopped, trying to find words for something I'd never really articulated before. Because Gregory made me feel like what I did wasn't impressive enough. So instead of defending it or explaining why it mattered, I just started downplaying it, making myself smaller so he wouldn't have as much to criticize. Adrian leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with the kind of expression he usually reserved for customers who brought him cars they'd tried to fix themselves with YouTube videos and prayer. Thomas, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard you say. And I once heard you try to explain why Clara needed a $50 face cream. Despite everything, I laughed. Actually laughed, for the first time since that disaster of a dinner party. It was supposedly made with rare minerals or some shit, right? And you believed that because you wanted to make her happy, even though you knew it was ridiculous. Adrian grabbed another slice of pizza and pointed it at me like a greasy finger of truth. Just like you believed Gregory when he made you feel like your work didn't matter, even though you probably knew better. The worst part was that he was absolutely right. Somewhere along the way, I had started seeing myself through Gregory's eyes instead of my own. I had let his definition of success become my definition of failure. I had accepted his assessment of my worth without ever considering that maybe, just maybe, Gregory Lawson didn't know what the hell he was talking about. You know what kills me? I said, feeling something like anger starting to build in my chest again. My company values what I do. My boss respects my opinions. I get emails from other departments asking for my input on projects. But I never told Clara any of that because I thought it would sound like bragging. Bragging about being good at your job, Adrian said flatly. Yeah, that's definitely something you should hide from your wife. When you put it like that, it sounds insane. Brother, it is insane. You've been living like you owe the world an apology for existing. Adrian finished his beer and stood up to get another one. But here's the thing. The outside world already knows you're valuable. You just stop believing it yourself. And that was the moment everything clicked into place. Not just the anger or the hurt pride, but the fundamental realization that I had been living my life according to someone else's scorecard. Gregory's scorecard. A scorecard where the only things that mattered were titles and bank accounts and country club memberships. But there were other scorecards out there. Scorecards where competence mattered more than connections, where solving problems mattered more than playing politics, where being a decent human being mattered more than driving the right car or living in the right neighborhood. I had just forgotten that those other scorecards existed. Adrian's kitchen table had become my unofficial office, and let me tell you, it was a hell of a lot more productive than the fancy home office Clara had insisted we set up in our guest bedroom. You know, the one with the expensive ergonomic chair that looked great in Instagram photos, but was about as comfortable as sitting on a medieval torture device. Here at Adrian's place, I was getting more work done on a wobbly table from the 90s than I had in months of trying to concentrate, while Clara complained about everything from the neighbor's dog barking to the landscaping crew showing up too early. It was day 9 of my exile from suburban paradise when I decided to do something I hadn't done in 3 years. I updated my LinkedIn profile. Not because I was actively job hunting, mind you, but because Adrian's little truth bomb about nobody knowing what I actually did for a living had gotten me thinking. Maybe it was time to stop hiding my light under a bushel, as my grandmother used to say. Maybe it was time to actually own what I was good at instead of apologizing for it. So I spent a couple hours crafting a profile that actually reflected what I did instead of what I thought sounded appropriately humble. I listed the projects I'd led, the systems I'd implemented, the money I'd saved my company through process improvements. I included the certifications I'd earned, the training programs I'd developed, and the cross-departmental initiatives I'd managed. For the first time in years, I wrote about my work like it mattered, because guess what? It did. The response was almost immediate, and I'm not talking about the usual spam from insurance salespeople and multi-level marketing schemes that LinkedIn is famous for. I'm talking about real messages from real recruiters at real companies who had apparently been paying attention to people like me while I'd been busy convincing myself I was invisible. The first email showed up that afternoon, while I was taking a break from actual work to scroll through job postings just to see what was out there. The subject line was simple and direct: Senior Data Analytics Position, Houston. My first thought was that it was probably just another recruiter fishing for leads, but something made me click on it anyway. Dear Thomas, it began, which was already more personal than the usual copy-paste jobs I'd gotten used to. I came across your profile and was impressed by your experience in data optimization and process improvement. We have a position that might be of interest to you. Might be of interest. Right. Like I was some hotshot executive who got courted by headhunters on a regular basis. But I kept reading, and the more I read, the more my eyebrows climbed toward my hairline. They were looking for someone to lead their data analytics division. Not just participate in it, not just contribute to it, but actually lead it. Build it from the ground up. They wanted someone with my exact skill set, my exact experience, my exact background in turning messy data into actionable insights. It was like someone had written a job description specifically for me. Except this job description came with a salary that made my current paycheck look like lunch money. I read the email 3 times before it sank in that this wasn't some mistake or mass mailing gone wrong. This was a legitimate opportunity from a legitimate company that was legitimately interested in what I could bring to the table. The company was based in Houston, which was far enough from Gregory's sphere of influence that I'd never have to worry about running into him at some charity golf tournament, but close enough that it wouldn't feel like fleeing to another planet. By the end of the week, my inbox was looking like a recruiting convention had exploded in it. Companies in Dallas, Austin, Denver, Phoenix, all looking for people with my skills. Data analytics was apparently a hot field, which was news to me since I'd spent the last 3 years listening to Gregory dismiss it as computer work and Clara act like it was some kind of glorified bookkeeping. But the Houston offer was the one that kept drawing my attention. The company was called Apex Analytics, which sounded appropriately corporate without being pretentious about it. They specialized in helping other companies make sense of their data, which was exactly the kind of work I'd been doing, but on a larger scale and with actual recognition for the value it provided. The CEO had started the company 5 years ago and was looking to expand, which meant there would be room to grow instead of just maintaining the status quo forever. The best part? They weren't looking for someone with an MBA from Harvard or connections to the right country clubs. They wanted someone who could actually do the work, who understood that data analysis wasn't just about making pretty charts, but about finding patterns that could save companies millions of dollars or help them make better decisions. They wanted someone who knew that the real value wasn't in the spreadsheets themselves, but in what the spreadsheets could tell you about the business. In other words, they wanted exactly what I had been doing for years while Gregory was dismissing it as unimportant. I spent hours researching the company, reading their case studies, looking up their leadership team on LinkedIn. Everything I found made them look more legitimate, more impressive, and more like the kind of place where I could actually build something meaningful instead of just keeping my head down and hoping nobody noticed me. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from Clara. The house was apparently falling apart at an alarming rate, which would have been more concerning if I hadn't spent the last 3 years keeping it running with the kind of attention to detail that Clara had never bothered to notice. The pool filter had given up completely, the lawn looked like a nature preserve, and the garbage disposal was making sounds that she described as demonic. But here's the funny thing about being away from all that domestic chaos. I realized I didn't miss it. Not the constant maintenance, not the endless list of household projects, not even Clara's running commentary on everything I was doing wrong. What I missed was feeling appreciated for the things I contributed, and that was something I apparently wasn't going to get from my current situation. Gregory kept calling Clara's phone demanding to know when I'd get over it and come back to be his favorite punchline again. He still didn't understand that this wasn't about getting over anything. This was about realizing that I had options, that I had value, that I didn't have to accept being treated like the help just because I'd married into a family that confused wealth with worth. The Houston recruiter called on Friday afternoon while I was sitting on Adrian's couch, watching him fix yet another neighbor's car problem. Her name was Sarah. She had a Texas accent that made everything sound friendlier, and she talked about the position like it was an opportunity instead of a favor she was doing me. "We've been looking for someone with your background for months," she said. "Would you be interested in a phone interview next week?" I looked around Adrian's simple apartment, with its secondhand furniture and unpretentious atmosphere, then thought about Clara's house, with its designer everything and underlying dysfunction. I thought about Gregory's dismissive laughter and his assumption that I'd never amount to anything important. "Yeah," I said, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something that might have been excitement. I'd definitely be interested. After I hung up, Adrian looked over from the engine he was working on. "Good news." "Maybe," I said. "Houston." He grinned, wiping grease off his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. "About damn time someone noticed you know what you're doing." The phone interview with Apex Analytics was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 10, which gave me exactly enough time to panic about it for 3 days straight. Not because I wasn't qualified. Adrian's pep talk had finally convinced me that I actually knew what I was doing, but because it had been so long since anyone had treated my professional opinions like they mattered that I'd almost forgotten how to talk about my work without apologizing for it. I spent Monday night at Adrian's kitchen table, surrounded by printouts of the company's website, notes about their client base, and a legal pad covered in talking points that I'd written and rewritten until they looked like hieroglyphics. Adrian came home from the shop, took one look at my preparation spread, and shook his head. "Jesus, Thomas, you look like you're studying for the bar exam. It's a job interview, not a dissertation defense." "I know, I gestured at the papers scattered across the table. "I haven't done this in a while. What if I sound like an idiot? What if they realize they made a mistake reaching out to me?" Adrian grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat down across from me, pushing aside my notes like they were yesterday's newspaper. "Let me ask you something. When you fixed Mrs. Henderson's computer last month, did you apologize for knowing how to do it?" Mrs. Henderson was Adrian's 80-year-old neighbor who'd been convinced that her laptop had been hacked by Russians, when really she'd just downloaded about 50 toolbars and turned her browser into digital sludge. I'd spent 20 minutes cleaning it up while she made me cookies and told me I was a computer genius. "No, but that's different." "How is it different?" "You had a problem, you knew how to solve it, you solved it. Nobody questioned whether you were qualified to remove malware. You just did the work." He took a swig of his beer and pointed at my laptop. "This is the same thing, except instead of Mrs. Henderson's cookies, you get a salary that doesn't make you wince when you look at it." He had a point. I'd been treating this interview like I was asking for permission to be good at my job, instead of demonstrating that I already was good at it. Classic imposter syndrome, except I was imposing on myself. Tuesday morning arrived with all the subtlety of a freight train. I'd set up in Adrian's bedroom for privacy, wearing my best shirt and hoping the video call wouldn't pick up the sound of his neighbor's motorcycle being resurrected in the parking lot. At exactly 10 o'clock, my laptop chimed with the incoming call. Sarah Martinez, the recruiter, appeared on my screen looking professional but approachable, sitting in what was clearly an actual office with actual windows that didn't face a parking lot full of pickup trucks. Behind her, I could see part of what looked like a modern workspace, the kind with glass walls and standing desks and probably a coffee machine that didn't require coins. "Thomas, thanks for making time today. I'm excited to talk with you about this opportunity." And just like that, we were off. But here's the thing. Within about 5 minutes, I realized this wasn't like any job interview I'd ever had. Sarah wasn't trying to trip me up with hypothetical scenarios or asking me to solve puzzles that had nothing to do with the actual work. She was asking me to talk about projects I completed, problems I'd solved, systems I'd improved. She wanted to know about the time I'd identified a data processing bottleneck that was costing my current company thousands of dollars per month and how I'd fixed it. She was genuinely interested in the process improvement program I developed that had reduced report generation time by 60%. For the first time in 3 years, someone was asking me to explain my work like it was actually impressive instead of just Excel stuff. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need, Sarah said after I'd walked her through a particularly complex analysis I'd done on customer retention patterns. We've got clients sitting on gold mines of data, but they don't know how to extract value from it. They need someone who can see the big picture and translate technical insights into business strategy. Business strategy. When was the last time anyone had used those words in connection with my work? Gregory certainly hadn't when he was introducing me as someone who'd never be anyone important. The conversation lasted almost an hour, and by the end of it, I felt like I'd remembered how to speak a language I'd forgotten I was fluent in. Sarah asked smart questions, understood my answers, and didn't once make me feel like I needed to dumb down my explanations or apologize for being competent. "I'm going to be straight with you, Thomas," she said as we wrapped up. "We've been looking for someone with your background for months. Most candidates either have the technical skills but can't communicate with business stakeholders, or they can talk to executives but don't really understand the data. You seem to have both, plus the leadership experience we're looking for." Leadership experience. Another phrase that had never come up in Gregory's assessment of my career prospects. "I'd like to set up a call with our CEO, Marcus Chun, for later this week. Would Friday work for you?" I said yes, because at this point I was curious to see just how far this rabbit hole went. After we hung up, I sat in Adrian's bedroom for a few minutes, staring at my laptop screen and trying to process what had just happened. Someone had just spent an hour listening to me talk about my work and acting like it was not only legitimate, but actually valuable. Revolutionary concept. Adrian was waiting in the kitchen with coffee and a shit-eating grin. "So, how'd it go?" "They want me to talk to the CEO on Friday." "No kidding? What's the job pay?" I told him the salary range Sarah had mentioned, and Adrian nearly choked on his coffee. "Jesus Christ, Thomas. That's more than I make in 2 years." "It's a 45% raise from what I'm making now," I said, still not quite believing it myself. "Plus full benefits, stock options, and they want me to build the department from scratch." "Build the department," Adrian repeated. "So you'd be the boss?" "I'd be the director of data analytics. I'd have a team, a budget, actual authority to make decisions." I sat down across from him, shaking my head. 3 days ago, Gregory was telling people I'd never be anyone important. Now someone wants to pay me a fortune to be important at their company. Adrian laughed, the kind of genuine, unsympathetic laugh that I was learning to appreciate. "So what's the catch?" "There's got to be a catch. It's in Houston. I'd have to move. And that's a problem because..." I thought about it. Really thought about it. Moving would mean leaving behind Clara's house with its endless maintenance issues and designer dysfunction. It would mean never again sitting through one of Gregory's dinner parties where I was the evening's entertainment. It would mean starting over somewhere nobody knew me as the guy who married above his station and couldn't quite keep up. "Actually," I said, "I'm not sure it is a problem." My phone buzzed with another text from Clara. "The air conditioning is making horrible noises, and I don't know who to call. Also, your father called looking for you. He wants to know when you're coming home." "Your father?" "Not my father or dad. Your father, like Gregory, was somehow my responsibility instead of hers." I showed Adrian the message, and he snorted. "Timing, right? It's like the universe is trying to make this decision for me." "Maybe it is," Adrian said. "Or maybe you've just finally reached the point where you're ready to make it yourself." The CEO call was scheduled for Friday at 2 o'clock. I had 3 days to decide whether I wanted to find out just how far this opportunity could take me, or whether I wanted to go back to being Clara's household maintenance manager and Gregory's favorite punchline. When I put it like that, the choice seemed pretty obvious. The call with Marcus Chun had gone even better than the interview with Sarah, if that was possible. The guy was sharp, direct, and had zero interest in small talk about golf handicaps or which private school his kids attended. He wanted to know about data architecture, process optimization, and team building. We spent 90 minutes talking shop like two people who actually understood what the other one did for a living, and by the end of it, I felt like I'd found my professional soulmate. "We'd like to make you an offer," Marcus had said, just like that. No games, no politics, no waiting 3 weeks to consider all candidates while they played power games. "Sarah will call you Monday with the details, but I can tell you right now, we want you to start as soon as possible." That was Friday. By Sunday morning, I knew I was taking the job even before I heard the official offer. It wasn't just about the money, although the 45% raise didn't hurt. It was about working with people who valued what I brought to the table instead of treating it like an inconvenience they had to tolerate. Which brought me to the task I'd been dreading, going back to Clara's house to get my stuff. Adrian had volunteered to help, bless his grease-stained heart, and we waited until Tuesday afternoon when we knew Clara would be out getting her weekly mani-pedi with her mother. 2 hours of forced bonding time, where they'd probably spend the entire session talking about how unreasonable I was being and how men just couldn't handle their emotions properly. Perfect timing for a stealth operation. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. Pristine lawn care courtesy of the service I'd arranged and paid for, perfectly manicured flower beds that Clara's landscaper maintained, and that ridiculous BMW sitting in the driveway like a monument to priorities I'd never understood. But as soon as Adrian and I walked through the front door, it was obvious that appearances were deceiving. "Jesus Christ," Adrian muttered, looking around the living room. What happened here? The place looked like a tornado had hit it, if tornadoes were specifically designed to target household maintenance and basic organization. There were bills scattered across the coffee table. Actual paper bills, the kind you get when you forget to pay the electronic ones. The kitchen sink was full of dishes that had clearly been there for days, and there was a suspicious smell coming from the direction of the garbage disposal that suggested Clara had been trying to use it despite whatever demonic sounds it had been making. "This is what happens when the invisible man stops being invisible," I said, stepping over a pile of mail that had apparently just been dropped on the floor near the front door. Turns out I did more around here than anyone realized. We headed upstairs to the bedroom, where I started packing clothes that felt like they belonged to someone else. 3 years of buying shirts and ties that I thought would make me look more successful, more worthy of being Gregory Lawson's son-in-law. Looking at them now, folded neatly in my suitcase, I realized I'd been dressing like I was playing a character instead of being myself. "You taking all this?" Adrian asked, gesturing at the closet full of business casual costumes. "The good stuff," I said. "I'll need professional clothes for the new job, but I'm leaving behind anything I bought specifically to impress Clara's family." That eliminated about half my wardrobe, including a blazer that cost more than most people's monthly car payments and had made me feel like a fraud every time I wore it. My laptop was next, along with the books I'd accumulated over the years, technical manuals, business strategy guides, and a few novels that Clara had always complained about because they cluttered up the bedroom. Funny how everything I actually cared about was considered clutter in her perfectly curated world. The office was where things got interesting. I'd set up a little workspace in the corner of our guest bedroom, complete with a filing cabinet where I kept all our important documents organized in a way that actually made sense. Insurance papers, warranty information, household maintenance schedules, tax documents. All the boring stuff that kept our life running smoothly, while Clara focused on more important things like choosing the right shade of throw pillows. I packed my personal files and left everything else exactly where it was, with a little note on top. House files. Insurance folder is blue. Warranty folder is green. Tax documents are in the bottom drawer. Good luck. Adrian found me in the garage, looking at the wall of tools I'd accumulated over the years. Everything from basic screwdrivers to the power drill I'd used to hang every picture in the house, mount every TV bracket, and assemble every piece of furniture that Clara had ordered online and expected to magically appear in working condition. "You leaving all this?" he asked. "Most of it. Clara's going to need it more than I will." I grabbed my laptop bag and a few specialty tools that had been gifts from my dad. Besides, I'm betting the new place in Houston will have a maintenance crew that doesn't require me to fix everything myself. We loaded up Adrian's truck with my boxes and suitcases, and I took one last look around the house that had never really felt like home anyway. The place where I'd spent 3 years trying to be someone else, trying to fit into a world that had never actually wanted me to fit. Before we left, I stopped by my old office building. It was a Tuesday afternoon, so the place was humming with the kind of productive energy that I'd actually missed during my exile at Adrian's place. Marcus, the receptionist, looked up when I walked in, and his face lit up in a way that reminded me why I'd always liked this job, even when my home life was making me miserable. Thomas. Hey, man, we've been wondering where you disappeared to. Taking some vacation time. Something like that, I said, pulling out an envelope I'd prepared that morning. Listen, I need you to do me a favor. If Gregory Lawson comes looking for me, tall guy, expensive suit, acts like he owns the place, give him this. Marcus raised an eyebrow but took the envelope without question. He'd been the receptionist here long enough to see all kinds of workplace drama, and he had a policy of not asking questions that weren't his business. I handed him $100 bill along with the envelope. What's this for? He asked. Call it a tip for excellent customer service, I said. And Marcus? When Gregory reads that note, pay attention to his reaction. I think you'll find it educational. Marcus grinned and tucked both the envelope and the cash into his desk drawer. You got it, boss. This sounds like it's going to be interesting. Oh, it will be, I said. Trust me on that. Walking out of that office building felt like shedding a skin I'd outgrown. I was done being the guy who apologized for taking up space. Done being the punchline to Gregory's jokes about unsuccessful in-laws. I had a new job waiting for me in Houston, a new life where my skills were valued instead of dismissed, and a new understanding of exactly what I was capable of when I stopped letting other people define my worth. Adrian was waiting in the truck, engine running, ready to help me load the last of my old life into boxes and drive toward whatever came next. So, he said as I climbed into the passenger seat, you really think this Gregory guy is going to come looking for you? I thought about the note I'd sealed in that envelope, the words I'd chosen carefully to deliver maximum impact with minimum explanation. Oh, he'll come looking, I said. And when he does, he's going to get a very educational surprise about just how unimportant I really am. I was 3 hours into my drive to Houston, somewhere between the endless strip malls of suburban Dallas and the kind of open highway that makes you believe in fresh starts, when my phone started buzzing like an angry wasp trapped in a jar. I'd pulled over at one of those gas stations that doubles as a truck stop and triples as a monument to American excess. The kind of place where you can buy beef jerky, lottery tickets, and a Confederate flag, all from the same impulse buy rack. The caller ID showed Marcus from my old office, and I have to admit, my heart rate picked up a little. I'd been wondering when Gregory would finally show up looking for me, and apparently today was the day. Thomas. Marcus's voice had that barely contained excitement that people get when they've just witnessed something spectacular. Man, you need to hear this. Did he come? Oh, he came all right. About an hour ago. Marcus was clearly enjoying himself, and I could hear the grin in his voice. This guy walks in here like he owns the building, wearing a suit that probably costs more than my car. Real smooth operator, you know? Introduces himself as Gregory Lawson. Says he's looking for Thomas Anderson. Needs to speak with you about family matters. I leaned against my Honda Civic, watching 18-wheelers roll past on the interstate, and tried to picture Gregory in my modest little office building. The guy was probably used to corporate headquarters with marble lobbies and security guards who called him sir. Our place had fluorescent lighting and a vending machine that ate your quarters. So I give him your note, right? He takes it like he's expecting some kind of apology letter or maybe a resignation notice. Opens it up real casual, like he's checking his mail. And, dude, Marcus paused for dramatic effect, and I could practically hear him savoring the memory. His face went through about 6 different colors. Started out normal, then went kind of pale, then red, then this weird gray color like he was about to throw up. He read it once, then read it again, then just stood there staring at the paper like it was written in a foreign language. I had to laugh. I'd spent a lot of time crafting that note, choosing each word carefully to deliver maximum impact with surgical precision. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, but sometimes the shortest messages hit the hardest. Then what happened? Then he looks up at me and asks, I shit you not. He asks if you'd mentioned anything about coming back. Not when you'd be back, not if you were okay, but if you'd mentioned coming back at all. Like he was suddenly realizing this might not be some temporary tantrum. That was exactly what I'd been hoping for. Gregory had spent so many years thinking of me as a minor inconvenience that he'd never considered the possibility I might actually leave permanently. In his world, people like me didn't have options. We were supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps of respect we could get from our betters. What did you tell him? I told him the truth, that you'd cleaned out your stuff and hadn't said anything about plans to return. That seemed to shake him up even more. He asked me if I knew where you'd gone, and when I said I didn't, he actually looked, I don't know, worried. Like this was not going according to whatever plan he had in his head. Marcus was right. Gregory had probably expected me to sulk for a few days, maybe a week, then come crawling back with my tail between my legs and a proper apology for being so dramatic about his little dinner party joke. The idea that I might actually have walked away for good had clearly never occurred to him. But here's the best part. Marcus continued, and I could tell he was saving the good stuff for last. Right before he left, he turned around and asked me, and I quote, "Was Thomas actually good at his job here? Like he just realized he had no idea what you did or how well you did it." What did you tell him? I told him you were the best analyst we'd had in 5 years, that other departments were always asking to borrow you for projects, and that management had been talking about promoting you before you disappeared. His face got that gray color again. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Gregory had spent 3 years dismissing my work as Excel stuff, without ever bothering to find out what I actually contributed. Now he was discovering that his assessment might have been slightly off the mark. Then he left without saying another word. Marcus finished. Just walked out looking like someone had told him his stock portfolio had crashed. What the hell did you write in that note, man? I looked out at the highway stretching toward Houston, toward my new life and my new job, where people actually valued what I brought to the table. Nothing complicated. Just the truth. Come on, you gotta tell me. I've been dying to know since you handed me that envelope. I told him that I'd turned down 5 better job offers over the past 3 years for Clara's sake, I said, and that yesterday I'd accepted the 6th. Marcus went quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Holy shit, Thomas. You mean you could have left any time? I mean, I stayed in a job that undervalued me, in a marriage where I was taken for granted, and in a family that treated me like hired help, because I thought that's what commitment looked like. I thought putting other people's comfort above my own worth was noble or something. And now I'm driving to Houston to start a job that pays almost 50% more than what I was making, with a company that actually wants me to succeed instead of just hoping I'll stay quiet and grateful. My phone buzzed with another call, Clara this time. I let it go to voicemail and waited to see what fresh disaster needed my immediate attention. The message was longer than usual, and I could hear the panic creeping into her voice as she talked. Thomas, I don't know what's going on, but my father came home looking like someone died. He's been asking questions about your job, about what you actually do there, and I didn't know what to tell him because honestly I never really. Look, we need to talk. There are things falling apart here that I can't handle, and now I find out you were getting job offers. Why didn't you tell us you were important at your work? Was this all some kind of test to see if we'd figure it out ourselves? Even in her panic, even in her moment of realization that maybe she'd been wrong about me, Clara still managed to make it about her. About what I'd failed to tell them. About how I'd somehow deceived them by not properly advertising my value. But there was something else in her voice too. Something that sounded almost like respect, mixed with the dawning understanding that the guy she'd been taking for granted might actually be worth taking seriously. Too little, too late. I deleted the voicemail and got back on the road to Houston. Behind me, Gregory was probably sitting in his mansion, staring at my note, and trying to figure out how the insignificant little man he'd publicly humiliated had managed to have options he'd never known about. Clara was probably standing in their increasingly chaotic house, finally understanding that all the practical magic that had kept their world running smoothly hadn't been magic at all. It had been me. And I was driving toward a future where none of that mattered anymore, where I'd be valued for what I could do instead of dismissed for what I wasn't. Houston became my fresh start in every way that mattered. The city was hot, sprawling, and completely indifferent to whatever social hierarchies had existed in my previous life. Nobody here gave a damn about Gregory Lawson or his dinner party opinions about who was important and who wasn't. My new boss, Ariana Chun, Marcus's daughter who'd taken over day-to-day operations while he focused on strategy, introduced me to the team on my first day as the man who's going to revolutionize our data systems. Not the guy who worked with spreadsheets, not someone who'd never amount to anything important, but the man who was going to make their company better at what they did. Nobody laughed. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody made jokes about Excel work. They listened when I talked about process improvements. They asked intelligent questions about my analysis methodologies. They treated my ideas like they had value because, apparently, they actually did have value. Revolutionary concept. A year later, Adrian came to visit my new apartment in downtown Houston. We sat on my balcony, drinking beer and watching the city lights twinkle like earthbound stars, and I realized I'd found something I hadn't even known I was looking for: respect. So, Adrian said, halfway through his second beer and wearing that shit-eating grin I'd learned to love, "Whatever happened to that note? Did you ever find out what you actually wrote?" I laughed, remembering that day at the gas station when Marcus had called to describe Gregory's reaction. "You really want to know?" "I've been dying to know for a year, you bastard." I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my notes until I found it. The exact wording I'd crafted so carefully that day, designed to deliver maximum impact with surgical precision. "Dear Gregory," I read aloud, "thank you for helping me realize my true worth at your dinner party. You were right that I'll never be anyone important in your world. Fortunately, other worlds exist. I've turned down 5 better job offers over the past 3 years to keep Clara happy. Yesterday, I accepted the 6th. Good luck with the Excel work. Thomas." Adrian nearly spit out his beer. That's it. That's what made him turn gray. "Sometimes the most devastating truths are the simplest ones," I said. Gregory spent 3 years convinced I was exactly what I appeared to be: a small man with a small job who should be grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance his family threw my way. The idea that I'd been choosing to stay, that I'd had options all along, that other people actually valued what he'd dismissed as worthless, that shattered his entire understanding of the situation. And Clara? I shrugged. Clara called a few times in those first months. Apologized for not knowing about my job offers, said she'd had no idea I was important at work. Even in her apologies, she couldn't quite grasp that the problem wasn't her ignorance about my career. It was her complete lack of curiosity about who I actually was. The divorce papers had been finalized 6 months ago. Clara got the house, which was fair since she'd need all the maintenance headaches that came with it. I got my freedom, which turned out to be worth significantly more than any real estate. You ever think about what would have happened if Gregory hadn't pulled his little stunt that night? Adrian asked. I considered it, watching the Houston skyline stretch toward the horizon like a promise of possibilities. Honestly, I probably would have stayed. I would have kept making myself smaller, kept accepting less than I deserved, kept believing that quiet endurance was somehow noble. Gregory did me the biggest favor of my life when he decided to humiliate me in front of his friends. Funny how that works. Yeah, he tried to put me in my place, and instead he showed me I belonged in a completely different place. I raised my beer in a mock toast. To Gregory Lawson, the best career counselor I never paid for. Adrian laughed and clinked his bottle against mine. To getting exactly what you deserve. To living well, I corrected. Because that really is the best revenge. That night, standing on my balcony overlooking a city that had welcomed me without reservations, I understood something Gregory would never grasp. Success isn't about making other people feel small. It's about becoming so comfortable with your own worth that their opinions stop mattering entirely. The best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong. It's building a life so good that their approval becomes irrelevant.